Hi all, welcome to the final lecture of our first course cycle. Can you believe we're here already? This week marks the last big info dump in terms of new content for this semester. We do have 6 more weeks to go, but we're going to spend that time revisiting, remixing, and revising our understanding of the concepts presented up until now. In terms of the MDA design framework we were discussing last week, as of now, you have all the mechanical pieces of design theory that I plan to present in this course. And in our second cycle, starting next week, we'll be shifting to considering the different design dynamics and aesthetics that we can build from that foundation. So, in one sense at least, you have learned, by the end of this lecture, everything that I have to teach you. And I have to say, I have been so impressed and pleased with the work you have all done so far, so just take a moment to feel good about yourselves before we move on. I know this has just been the most stressful year for teaching in generations, if not all time, but I just want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, you're doing great. You've already finished the hard part as of this week. Okay, so anyway, let's talk about features and affordances of media. Up until now, I've been using the term affordance a little bit loosely as it applies to media studies, because the original concept is rooted in the idea of interaction. Affordances are basically the interactions that are available to you in a given situation or with a given object. And the simple fact is that the categories of media we have studied so far are, on a basic level, not interactive. They don't actually respond to anything you do. They can be read in different ways to some extent, but that's you interpreting. The media don't change. And they each have a certain set of formal features that constrain how you can do that reading and interpreting to a very significant extent. So the different affordances between media categories are important to consider, but within each category, there is fundamentally really only one way to read and interpret that kind of media. But now, in this last category, we are in the realm of truly interactive objects, and the different affordances available are much more significantly different within the category of interactive media than within the other media categories. This is a very broad and diverse category, and it really only has one unifying feature, which I brought up last week, and that is feedback. So, for our last new topic of the semester, I'm going to take you through different considerations and mechanisms around feedback, try to give you some useful examples, and hopefully you'll have a clear sense of what I'm going to be looking for in your interactive media lesson plan drafts, which are the last thing in this cycle due at the end of this week. So, up front, and I'll say this again at the end, what you have to do for the interactive media lesson plan is include some sort of media that generates its own feedback, independent of what you're doing as the instructor. That's what I'm looking for here. And if you're still confused at the end of this lecture and the rest of this week's readings, email me or post in the Ask a Question forum, and I'll try to clarify further. So here's the outline of different affordances and considerations around feedback for designing with interactive media. This is a pretty long list, and it's not even a complete list. I could honestly teach a whole class just on this concept, and in fact I do in the spring, Games and Gamification for Teaching and Learning, which is really all about feedback. So these are some of the mechanics of designing with feedback, and then the second reading for this week, the Bowden-Malloy paper, will touch on some of that as well, but mostly that paper is all about considering the dynamic and even the aesthetic view of feedback in instructional design, in the sense of what are we really trying to do with this concept of feedback at all. But right now, we're going to start off with mechanics. Some of these probably look familiar, and we'll go through those very quickly. Like, I'm sure everybody is already very familiar with the Wizzywig principle. Who doesn't know that? So I don't think we'll spend too much time on that one. And then a couple of others, though, might need a little more explanation, but I'll try to stay on topic and go reasonably quick. Also, just to note, I've framed these all as binary options, but mostly these are really different ends of a continuous spectrum, and it's totally possible to have both versions of feedback in the same interactive media design in different ways. That said, I'm going to focus on distinguishing each pair from each other, highlighting the differences here. But just remember that in practice, none of these things are necessarily mutually exclusive or opposed. Okay, so number 1, synchronous versus asynchronous feedback. Obviously, we're already familiar with this distinction already. I feel like these are the only 2 words I see on the internet at all some days. But in feedback terms and instructional design terms, this is the difference between immediate feedback in the moment after every user action and feedback that only comes at certain intervals or after certain user actions. I've given an example here of a quiz where you get feedback after each answer versus a quiz where you only get feedback at the end after you finish the whole thing. Another example might be a live simulation where it's always running and you can plug in different pieces and immediately see what they do and how they respond in the simulated environment, versus a stop-and-go simulation where you have to arrange all the pieces, complete your design parameters the way you want, and then you hit play. So you don't necessarily know the effect of something you did right away. You have to wait and see between the building step and the running the simulation step to get that feedback. Number 2, single user versus multi-user. Again, this one is something you've already probably been familiar with, but in both these cases, the user is getting feedback from the interactive media object itself, but in the multi-user case, they're also potentially getting feedback from other users as well. So as an instructional designer, this comes down to a question of, do you want that? Do you want your students to be getting feedback that you didn't create and that you don't really have control of? And if you do, how are you going to structure it through your design? If you look at social media, all the different apps are designed to encourage certain kinds of multi-user interactions and feedback. The feedback systems and the way users are expected to interact with each other is different on Facebook and Reddit and Instagram and TikTok and Twitch and so on. Each of these media has been designed to create certain kinds of interactions and generate certain kinds of feedback among users. So if you're going to do some kind of team or group work in your class, that's something you have to consider. What kind of peer feedback you're trying to draw out, and then how are you going to design to encourage that particular type of feedback and constrain other types of feedback you maybe don't want. Number 3, linear versus open. So this is more of an overall structural design consideration than a feedback-specific one, but you can think of it in feedback terms still. A linear design is meant to keep every user on basically the same path as they interact with the media object, and so feedback needs to be planned to keep them moving in the right direction and progressing through whatever they're doing. Essentially, in a linear design, you're establishing there is a correct way to interact with this media, and feedback is going to have to be framed in those terms. You're telling the user whether they're doing it right and to keep going, or that they're doing something wrong and need to back up and try again. Whereas in an open design, there's no specific planned sequence of interactions. Users can decide what to do next after each input and output output feedback loop, and so feedback is more likely to be open-ended, and users are going to need to take a more active role in interpreting it because they're setting their own goals. They have their own purposes within the range of affordances available to them. So feedback becomes much more subjective and needs to be interpretable to some extent to support that. Number 4, Wizzywig versus abstract or symbolic. So in case you don't know, Wizzywig stands for what you see is what you get. And in this context, that means that there is a natural or a logical relationship between a user's input and the feedback the interactive media item produces. So for a really simple example, if I type words into an interface and those words appear in the screen somewhere, that's Wizzywig. I type words, the words appear. What I did is exactly what I got out of the media interaction. This is a very simple form of feedback, but it's still feedback. But not all interactive media work this way. There are plenty of things out there where if I type in a certain word or set of words, then that will cause some command to execute in the program. Like if I type certain words into a spreadsheet program, the spreadsheet doesn't display those words. I don't get what I did. It runs a function that's connected somehow in the design to the words I entered. And if I don't know that specific program and know that command, I wouldn't really know how to interpret that feedback or even how to get that feedback in the first place. I need to know the right words in the first place. So this distinction is all about conventions, really. A Wizzywig feedback system just recreates conventions and understood relationships between inputs and outputs from some other domain, like language, while an abstract or symbolic feedback system has to be learned in its own right. You have to learn how to use the interactive media object first before you can really make use of it as a tool for further learning. Quite a few of you last week had examples of times where you thought something was Wizzywig, where you thought there was a natural logical relationship between what you were asking students or parents to do and what feedback they were seeing on their screen, when in fact it was not Wizzywig, it was abstract, and they had to be told explicitly what that feedback relationship was and what that meant. This question of what you see and what you get in terms of feedback also relates to number 5, monomodal versus intermodal. Very simply put, interactive media can either stick to a single mode for input and output, say text, write stuff in, receive written text back, or they can translate feedback into a different mode from the input. As teachers, we are generally pretty accustomed to delivering feedback primarily through writing or speaking, so depending on your subject and depending on what your students are doing, that might be monomodal or it might be intermodal feedback. Both of these approaches to feedback can be very useful in instruction, and I think in particular the affordances of intermodal feedback with interactive media are worth looking into more deeply than we're going to here. I'm sure a lot of you have come across the concept of learning analytics before, the ability to track all kinds of data and metadata about how students engage with digital learning platforms, everything from typing speed to frequently used words to changes in performance over time, and to easily represent that feedback in different modes, different ways. I'm not going to spend more than a minute on it today, but this is a big one, and if I was making bets, I would be betting on intermodal feedback becoming a really hot topic in learning design over the next few years, because this is a major leap forward in how media can support and create new affordances through instructional design. So you heard that here first. Moving on, number 6, perfect versus imperfect information. I'll use a game analogy for this one. So in chess, which is an example of interactive media, it's not digital, but it is interactive, both players can see the whole chessboard all the way through the game. That's perfect information. There's no perspective or potential source of feedback that's hidden in chess. The skill of getting good at it is learning how to process and prioritize all of that potential feedback information and only pay attention to the pieces that are valuable to you in your current situation. Then in a game like Scrabble, or in most card games, you have imperfect information where you know some things about the system, but there are pieces that are hidden from you. So you have to either go find that missing information, or you have to make decisions based on your best guesses using the information you do have and trying to account for what you don't have. Imperfect information is often a good way for you as a designer to constrain and guide your students in the direction you want them to go by saying, here's this piece of information you need, go find it, and that gives them a direction. But the flip side of that is that it requires you to take on more responsibility for prioritizing and organizing feedback information ahead of time to ensure that you're not leaving out any critical pieces somewhere that need to be available earlier or in a different form in order to be really useful, which can really derail a plan if you're not careful. If you have a piece of information and your students can't see it, and so they can't interact with your lesson design the way you expected. On the other hand, of course, perfect information can be really overwhelming, especially to a student who might be new to a particular interactive medium and doesn't know how to filter and process all that feedback in a useful way yet. So advantages and disadvantages to both of these feedback approaches is, I guess, what I'm saying. And then the last item for now, number 7, persistent versus session-based feedback. So persistent interactive media are things that can save your changes, programs or apps that save your inputs basically and store or redeploy feedback from prior sessions for you. Think about a game like Minecraft, where your stuff that you've built and your gear and the areas of the map you've explored, it's all still there if you leave the game and then come back later. Or for that matter, if you think about social media, posts you make or other people make that you have interacted with, they hang around and they can be scrolled back through again in the future if you want to and re-experience that same feedback again. This quality of persistence interacts very powerfully with multi-user interactive media because one user can make a change to the shared media environment, and then everyone else can see and experience that change as well, which is kind of mind-blowing if you stop to think about it. But not all interactive media are persistent. There's not really a good term I'm familiar with besides just not persistent, so I've gone with session-based, where you can get feedback during a single session, but then if you leave and come back, everything starts over from the beginning again. A lot of video games can be like this, like Overwatch or Fortnite, where every match is supposed to start off exactly the same. You don't carry anything over from one game to the next. Or for that matter, board games are like this. You always have to set the game board up the same way to start a new game. There's nothing kept over from the last time you played besides your own memories and maybe your growing understanding of the affordances of the game system, but nothing is actually stored in the media object itself. So in instructional design, this is the difference between, say, a project folder where you want students to be able to store information, keep a persistent record of the feedback they've already received, versus a review tool where you just want them to practice their skills in relative isolation from anything else. And so you have them start with a blank slate each time they enter the module, to place more emphasis on their own internal remembering and learning about the content without that external support. So, that was an extremely quick and dirty rundown of some of the mechanical possibilities of feedback in interactive media. Like I said at the beginning, this is far from a complete list of considerations. These are just some features that I think are particularly relevant from a teaching and learning perspective, but you can go much, much deeper on this if you want to. You could honestly do a PhD in this. Imagine that. And like I also said at the beginning, and I'm now repeating, I have presented all these factors as binary choices, but many, if not all of them, are more like different ends of a spectrum, and they overlap and interact in various ways as well, and can combine to create a whole other spectrum of dynamics and aesthetics as well. And then, as you're going to see in the Bowden-Malloy paper, the reverse direction also holds true, where established aesthetics and dynamics influence how users are going to conceptualize and interact with the mechanics and use them to learn more about the interactive media system. In Bloom's taxonomy terms, there's this cyclical relationship between the different levels of cognitive process, where you have basic recall and understanding contributing to more evaluative or creative learning processes, but then those creative processes also cycle back and reshape how a learner understands at the more basic level as they continue to grow and construct their understanding of the subject. I'll share a couple quick examples within the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics framework. Think back to last week, the Quest Atlantis game described in the paper by Sasha Barab and his co-authors, which had an overarching aesthetic of exploration and discovery, and supported that in part through use of imperfect information at the mechanical level, where students didn't start out with all the pieces they need to solve the problems in the game, and had to go find missing information and make educated guesses based on what they knew to move the story layer of the game along. And then think about that same imperfect information mechanic in this week's game, Spent, where you're given options of what to do at various points in the course of the game. But again, you don't necessarily have all the information about what the consequences of those choices will be. But Spent has a very different aesthetic than Quest Atlantis, and so the imperfect information mechanic takes on a very different meaning. It's stressful not to know everything in this context. You're not going out to discover the answers to your uncertainties and having fun exploratory adventures. You're trying to avoid mistakes, and you don't always have the information to know for sure that that's what you're doing. So the mechanics form the foundation that leads to dynamics and aesthetics, but then the aesthetic feeds back into how users think about and use the mechanics to interact with the system. Another example, one that's about to happen to you, this course features weekly group interactions through Blackboard posting. So there's a multi-user feedback mechanic in use. But after this week, the dynamics of those interactions are going to change, which is going to in turn alter your perception and the way you use those mechanics of the system as well. Up until now, we've been doing whole class discussions focused on responding to readings and sharing personal perspectives and experiences. And if you missed a week, it wasn't a big deal because no one was really depending on that feedback. But starting next week, I'm going to be sorting you into small project teams, and the dynamic will shift to giving more detailed personal feedback on each other's work. So now, other people in the class are depending on that feedback that you are generating in a more significant way. Same basic mechanics, same media platform, but the new dynamic influences how you perceive them and how you use them. The feedback you're giving and receiving through multi-user interaction mechanics takes on a different priority than when we were just tossing playlists at each other. Okay, almost done. Just a few reminders and housekeeping things I want to go over while you're here related to wrapping up Cycle 1 of the course and moving on to Cycle 2 next week. I've had a couple questions already about whether this thing or that thing counts as interactive media for the purposes of the lesson plan draft. So just to say it one final time, the thing I'm looking for in your interactive media lesson plan is feedback. You need to use media in a way that generates feedback independent of your active teaching presence. This can be coming directly from the media object or the app or the computer program or whatever you're using. It could also come through social interactions so long as they take place through a media platform, an online platform or something like your digital classroom or a social media page. And as long as they come from a classmate or another person who is not you. but your chosen interactive media thing needs to generate some sort of feedback for your students that's not coming directly from you, the teacher. If you do that, you are good. Next point, I'm going to be posting a survey as part of this week's check-in that I'm going to use to help me create the project teams that you'll be working in for the rest of the semester. There's 6 weeks left, counting finals week. So you're going to have one team for the next 3 weeks, then I'll reshuffle you and you'll have another team for a second round of workshopping in the last 3 weeks. But please get the survey done soon, as soon as possible. I do need as much lead time as I can get to get these teams set up, and I'm working hard to get everybody into a team with shared interests in terms of which projects you're going to be focused on workshopping together. But if you wait until the last minute, then I'm just going to have to toss you into whatever group has space left over, which will make nobody happy. Also, on that note, please, if you haven't already, go to the course information folder on the Blackboard page and read through the descriptions of the 2 non-lesson plan projects before you do the survey, so that you know whether you're interested in doing these at all and whether you want to prioritize them in what you're going to be doing for the team workshop. The rough drafts for both of these projects are due in 3 weeks officially. Just remember, I do accept project drafts even if they come in late. I just needed them to be due with at least a few weeks lead time before the end of the semester in order to give me and you and everybody enough time to workshop them if you want to. But the big part of organizing these teams is that you don't have to workshop every project. In fact, I don't expect you to revise and resubmit all 6 projects for the final portfolio. You can do that, but you only need 4 or so to be on the threshold for an A in the course, assuming you've kept up with everything else. And if you're okay with a B, then you probably only need to do 2 or 3 final draft revisions for your portfolio. So read those project outlines, decide which projects you want to submit for your team workshops and which you're going to do on your own or which you're maybe not going to bother revising if you've got more important stuff to focus on at the end of the semester than doing what would amount to extra credit past a certain point for just this one class. If you have any questions about any of that, the workshop process, the final course requirements, any of that, ask your questions now, this week, please. You can email me or you can post in the Ask a Question forum so others can see the answer as well, whatever works for you. Okay, I think that is it for Cycle 1. Great job, everybody. I'll see you in the check-in forum for this week, and I'm really looking forward to starting Cycle 2 with all of you next week.